Okay, so this is kind of fun and funny because I'm just going to interview myself as a stakeholder. And as the artiste of the materiality project, I'm giving myself artistic license to just go for it. And more legitimately, as somebody who's been interviewed many times as a stakeholder in more conventional materiality processes, I figured, why not interview myself? So it's perhaps a bit unconventional, but here goes. I'll be looking off screen as I've done for all the other interviews to make sure I check all the interview questions, and I'll just walk myself through the process. Something slightly different that I'll be asking myself to do as I go through this in the experimental form that it is I'll be bearing in mind my own guidance to others around taking into consideration non-human stakeholders. So I'm speaking as myself, regular citizen, but I'll be thinking about that perspective beyond humans just to try to implement my own guidance on that. And I'll be trying to figure it out as I go. So thanks for bearing with me. So my first question is always for the stakeholder to describe themselves, who I am, what I do in the world, and anything else I want people to know about me. So in sum, I am Lorraine Smith. I'm a writer, I'm an advisor and independent consultant. I've been working in the field of corporate responsibility, environmental, social, and governance, or ESG reporting, transparency, strategy, since mid 2003, so coming on to 20 years now. Prior to that, I had a kind of checkered past and wandered into the field a little bit happenstantially, I guess you could say. So I'll maybe just touch briefly on that other experience that I bring, since I think it's relevant to where I'm heading now and what some of my responses will be. I'll go back to my education, which might not have seemed to have much to do with anything, but is bearing out in all sorts of great ways. So I paid for my school by being an industrial tree planter in Northern Ontario. And any of the tree planters out there will know that's a kind of special cult, living in clear cuts and working from dawn to dusk, putting a tree in the ground for plantation harvesting for the pulp and paper industry. Little did I know. Great way to pay for school in any case, and that was probably a big part of my education without my realizing it. When I graduated from an honors BA in religious studies and German language, I went on to work at one of the largest environmental NGOs in the world, so World Wildlife Fund Canada. And I worked in the fundraising and communications area for a few years. Great way to see the inside of what I think is a very well-run and obviously globally recognized environmental NGO, and to notice that perhaps that isn't really the solution. Great information gathering, lots of amazing communication. But even back then, before I knew much at all about industry, I had a sense that felt a bit band-aidy or sort of chasing after the symptoms within the system that was causing the problem versus really designing the problem out of the system. Of course, a lot has changed at WWF, but I'd still be cautious about putting all of the solutioning into the hands of the big NGOs. From there, I wandered a bit and I lived in Australia for a year and just kind of temped and did a bit of this and that, scuba diving and backpacking and living pretty humbly. And then from there, I moved across the Tasman Sea to New Zealand. And that was partly as a hand spinner, which I've been for a very long time, working with thread and yarn and designing garments, which I've done since I was really a little kid and into my teens, got quite serious with it. So New Zealand, obviously kind of wool mecca for the hand spinners out there. And I continued to temp, but my first temping gig there, I lucked into an electronic engineering company that was going through a massive growth spurt. So it was kind of funny and yet also extremely informative and a great opportunity that I went from literally the temp receptionist to the manager of logistics and customer care, and suddenly had a management role on the team that was growing like crazy. Helped them implement ISO. I helped them hire their general manager while managing their European clients, because I speak a couple European languages, French, German, Portuguese, and a bit of Spanish. So I was able to help them with their rapidly expanding European marketplace. So great hands-on experience in a quickly growing company and the realities involved in that, inventory, staffing, etc. was also a manufacturing facility. So to really learn what I was up against, I spent some time in the factory on the line doing electronics manufacturing. Really great experience. So I sort of got an inside window into what goes on there. Of course, it's evolved a lot in the last 20 some years. But it was a great experience. I returned to Canada and started an artisanal paper business that made handmade paper to sell to businesses using their paper waste. So I was my own artisanal circular economy before I knew there was such a thing. Another great experience, learned a lot about design, managing a business, and also learned that the more I sold, the more I became a one-woman sweatshop or was going to need to outsource things, which didn't really inspire me as an artisan. From there, I got hired into a high-end graphic design firm in Toronto. So at this point, I'm back in my hometown. Did some amazing work with a great group called Q30, learned a lot, really enjoyed it. I was helping manage their accounts. However, from there, I got, to my surprise, headhunted into a financial services company, Manulife Financial, which is a large financial services company headquartered in Canada, but I was working for their US operations on their pension fund division, learning a lot about how people save. I was in what's called a business analyst role, which is kind of shorthand for problem solver across departments. So I was super fortunate to have a role that spanned marketing, communications, the actuaries that are looking at all the stats and information about investing, and the coders who were building the websites. This was in the early 2000s when online banking and online investing was really in its infancy, and those kinds of tools where you could sort of project your savings or your risk and reward and all that kind of things that are pretty standard now. 20 years ago were just sort of unheard of when we were building things from scratch. So it was a great experience. I learned a lot. I had amazing bosses, a lot of autonomy. I was paid well. I had good benefits, all the stuff you'd expect in the financial services sector. And after 3 years, I recognized that every time I went in the revolving door in the morning at the base of the tower, my body went in and my soul went out. And I decided that wasn't going to work for me over the long term. I left. I'm going to skip a little bit here, but I spun some yarn on a bus traveling across Canada, came back, realized I needed to get a proper job. And from there, I wandered into the field of corporate responsibility. And that has been my life for the last 20 years. I have worked in Canada. I've lived in the United States. Most of my client work has been with large international publicly traded companies across sectors: banking, energy, tech, media, agriculture, food, manufacturing, and probably a few more that I'm forgetting here, pretty much cross-sectorally, and mostly at the strategy and communications functions. So how do companies organize, plan, and implement their goals around sustainability? And over the last few years, that's really become centered on how do they communicate with their investors about how they're managing and sort of improving their ambitions on sustainability, which has eased into language that we now call environmental, social, and governance, or ESG reporting. There's a lot I could say about the language there, a lot of kind of hair splitting on what's what and categorizing. I'm not going to worry too much about that. I'm just going to say that's led me to where I am now, which is acknowledging that although there's been a lot of great work, I feel very blessed to have worked with the clients and amazing people that I've gotten to know over the years, and to have gone backstage with so many global companies doing pretty amazing, innovative things, really shaping the economy in many ways. It's been an incredible education. My feeling has been that it hasn't had the desired impact, or at least the impact I would desire, which is to reshape industry to be a force for healing, not just reducing harm or taking more stock of the harm that's being done. And that's led me to create this materiality project. So that's who I am. And I always ask my interviewees, do they have a commercial relationship with Google, the company that we're assessing today? And the answer is no, other than as a customer. So obviously I use Google tools, and you're seeing them all over the Materiality Project if you've clicked anywhere. And I pay them because I upgraded my storage, since apparently I've received so many emails that they don't fit anymore, probably mostly things that I should have deleted in 2013. Other than that, I do not have a commercial relationship. And in fact, one of the reasons I chose Google to start with, along with, because they have a global impact, and I think they're highly relevant to understanding our future as people interacting with industry in economic contexts. I don't have a relationship with them. I've never done any sustainability reporting strategy or any project work with them. So I felt it was a good kind of neutral space to start. So here we are. The other thing I always ask is, before going into is Google having a positive impact or negative impact on the future we want, what is the future we want? Because there are so many ways that that term gets bandied about. Certainly within the context of the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals, it's sort of predicated on the future we want. I forget paragraph 18 or some technical language from documents of a while back. And there's a lot baked into that concept, right? The future we want. So I ask, well, what is the future you want? What's the future I want? And I respect the work of, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation talking about the circular economy. I respect the many initiatives that are out there shaping and describing that future. And then I would tend to put pretty different words to it myself. And it's been really interesting to hear how other stakeholders have phrased that as well. So for me, in a nutshell, the future I want is one where all industry, all economic activity serves life, creates the conditions that enable life to thrive. And they do that by being in business, so that their business models are designed to deliver on their purpose in a way that enables life to thrive, regardless of what their product, service, or role within the so-called marketplace would be. And I'll give a concrete example of that, because I often find when I share that, most people haven't even given themselves permission to consider that a possibility. It literally elicits laughter. I should have warned you to swallow your, sip of coffee or whatever, if you happen to be eating, because it literally has caused people to laugh and spit things out. The idea of like industry enabling life to thrive. That's not what industry does. But I believe that it can, should, and must, in order to belong in a future that has humans in it. So what might that mean? There's lots of industries, and here's where I'll do my best to take a moment to sort of step out of character as just an individual human and imagine the wider web of life in which I am just one small part, and ponder that future. So let's take an industry sector, for example, like construction, commercial real estate, building. Here I am in Montreal, Canada. That's actually a map of Montreal. That red area is the downtown, the island of Montreal, all developed and built up. And this happens to be on a migratory bird flyway. So we see an amazing winged migration at this time of year, birds, bats, butterflies coming from very, very far down south and making their way. Some of them stay here and many of them carry on further north. And so I imagine a future where the industries involved in building, creating the built environment, are aware of those migratory birds, bats, butterflies, and those migratory flyways. And they're aware of the damage that's been done so far in terms of tall building structures and lights at night that cause a disorientation for those migrating species that become disoriented and strike the buildings. And there's some really disturbing numbers out there. I remember seeing just a couple of years ago, the figures from, they were called FLAP, Fatal Light Awareness Program. I think it's now Bird Canada, that up to 1 billion birds a year in North America alone were dying from building strikes through the disorientation of light. 1 billion birds a year. That is just a staggering figure. That's several birds per Canadian every year dying through building strikes. I don't know this for a fact, but I was actually trying to chase down some numbers on that. And my gut tells me that number's actually gotten lower, not because we're doing better, but because there are fewer birds migrating. I don't know, someone should fact check me on that and heckle in the comments. But the point is, the built environment until now, even with LEED certification and LEED Platinum and all kinds of amazing things that can happen in the context of buildings, has been contemplated in terms of energy efficiency, light optimization, air quality, all kinds of really important things that I'd love to see more of, but that have not contemplated, at least in a fundamental way, to any degree, the needs, wants, norms, and opportunities for our migratory species. So I would just say that is absolutely critical and needs to happen, and would be in the future, because why would the commercial real estate industry not take into account the other life if it is incentivized to do so? That's why it lives and breathes. So that's just a little bit of imagination around what one industry could be doing and how different a city like Montreal would be. I recognize in saying that that involves some disassembly, some radical change in terms of how cities are currently standing and how they would be built and remodeled going forward. And nowhere would I suggest that the sort of regenerative economy of the future is just a tweak on what we have today. So I guess in sum, I'd say the future I want looks really different than the present. Some kernels of it are already present with us, and I'll allude to some of that in a bit. So then that would swing me over to the questions specific to Google, or Alphabet, the parent company, and Google as it's more widely known. And so what I ask stakeholders to consider is to think about the positive impacts of the company when I think about Google's activities, and this is really focused on Google's business model, not the sort of charitable efforts that it may be undertaking. When I think about Google's business model, what do I believe it's doing, if anything, to contribute to that future that I just described? And what evidence or examples would I point to in as many details as I can provide? I'll try not to provide too many details because I could go on here, but I do think Google is doing a lot of really positive things, and I've had the opportunity to have most of the stakeholder conversations. There may be a few more getting added after this, but for the most part, I've already had the conversations and heard from a range of diverse stakeholders about many really awesome things going on, most of which I'm sure won't be a surprise to anybody listening to this. Things like enabling a level of collaboration with tools like Google Docs, Google Slides, Google Drive, et cetera, that allow for asynchronous, interregional, international, interlinguistic collaboration without anything more than internet access. In and of itself, that's sometimes a barrier, but once you've got that, it doesn't even require that much bandwidth in the grand scheme of things. And one stakeholder, Juliana Lopez, and you can watch her video or listen or click on the transcript, she noted how one of the reasons that Google has been more helpful in the context of some of the communities she's collaborating with in the Amazon basin is that the tools require less bandwidth than some of the other ones that they could be using. And so they're able to use Google to collaborate with those in more urban centers, those with more connections to some of the resources that they're tapping into, and they're able to go for it in a way that they couldn't before. Other obvious ways in which Google is contributing in a positive manner is allowing more information to flow in ways that would have been prohibitive before. So anybody, again, with access to the internet can find information that before would have either been inaccessible or require a lot of barriers to be leapt over. So going physically into a library and spending hours looking things up or requesting things, for example, or even just being able to translate and access the knowledge in a language that a person speaks and understands, recognizing there are still limitations with that translation function, of course, but it still allows access in a pretty phenomenal way. And I would go further to say that the kind of commons that Google has built, so enabling an infrastructure that is almost global and providing an interconnectivity around the world, connecting knowledge, collaboration, languages, regions, etc., projects, industry and societal sectors, it's pretty phenomenal. And so that level of kind of interconnected commons is really exciting. There's a dark side, and I'll touch on that in a second, but for sure, those are really positive things. And those are all based on the business model in the sense that those are the services that the company provides. However, I want to swing into the negative impacts of their activities and their sort of core offer, because although all of those things that I just mentioned are real, and that's how many of us interact with the Google, as I like to call it, that's for the most part not how they make money. So business model is a bit of a slippery term more and more these days, because while that is the business that Google delivers into most of the universe and how we experience them, the vast majority of their revenue does not come from that. Although some of us are paying bits and pieces for storage and other services, 80% of their revenue comes from advertising. And in 2021, their revenue was 259 billion US. That is a staggering sum of money in 1 year to flow into a company. It's more than flows into many countries. They are one of the largest companies under, if you just look at market capitalization. So, they are an economy unto themselves. And that happens by using our data, running very sophisticated algorithms, and applying artificial intelligence to sell advertising to millions of companies who pay them. That is how they make money. In and of itself, that isn't necessarily a problem, but there's two places where it breaks down for me and where I would say they are negatively affecting that future that I want. They are undermining its ability to exist. The first is simply, we can't see who those advertisers are. So with such limited transparency, the data asymmetry is mind-bending. I can see what ads get served up to me if I'm savvy enough to realize that something's even an ad. I mean, oftentimes these things are really subtle. I think it's become a little less subtle for regulatory reasons. But if I do a Google search, just yesterday I was kind of testing this theory, and I just searched food, just put food into the search bar. And the first item to come up is for a fish and chip shop, not too far from me. So the first thing it's doing is selling me some food. And no offense to the fish and chip shop, but not very good food. For extra fun, I took the step to click on it, which I usually don't with ads. And just to see, like, okay, who is this fish and chip shop, and what do they say about themselves? And they have the word sustainable fish splattered in a couple of places on their website. But when you try to pursue, what does that mean? Is it even Marine Stewardship certified, Marine Stewardship Council certified? You couldn't get there, just saw the words sustainable fish. So then for fun, I put sustainable fish into a Google search, and it just goes into all kinds of trouble. And anybody who's followed the trail with the MSC certification will know it currently is not slated to be in the future I want. It's got elements of what would be helpful, but by no means is it truly sustainable in a way that I believe is required. So the first thing that Google does is serve me an ad to go eat food that we could debate the impacts it would have on my own health. And then there's not much to say about the impacts it's having on the environmental health. That's a problem, but I'm still on problem one, which is we can't see who those advertisers are, except for what shows up on our own screens if we happen to be paying attention. And we can't see what data they're grabbing from us to mix and match and create those algorithms and generate those 259 billion US in sales, or 80% of that at least. They do have other bets, and you can read more about their anonymous vehicles and all kinds of interesting things, but those are small potatoes. Some of them are even not generating revenue at this point. So there's just massive data asymmetry. We cannot see how they're using the data and who they are getting that money from. Personally, I find that problematic and feels rather undermining to that future I want. And then building on that, the second piece of the problematic nature, so that undermining feeling I have about what's going on with the future, is those ads. What are they propagating? So where Google does provide a fair bit of what we could call ESG data, they don't produce an ESG report, but they publish lots of stuff on their environmental goals and impacts and their social activities, and a lot of it is pretty laudable, and a lot of money is flowing towards it, and some of it, by the way, is generated by their actual services, not just philanthropic efforts. So they can show how their services enable small businesses to do great things, et cetera, et cetera. But the real impacts of the company come from the impacts of their advertisers. So as millions and millions and millions of companies grow their business through advertising, they have an impact. And since we can't see who they are, we don't know what those impacts are, but let's just take a moment to speculate here. They are not, well, the food company, right? The fish and chip shop, the more that company grows, I would say the more the future I want is undermined. Until that company becomes a propagator of human health through high quality, nutritious food, maybe even education around what eating well means, which is a massive gap, which we already know. And the way in which they source their foods is genuinely restoring ecosystems, enabling the conditions that allow life to thrive, regenerating soil, allowing fish stocks to regenerate, working with fishers and farmers and other producers to be part of genuinely restoring life on Earth, not just maybe checking some boxes that show that it's less harmful. If all of Google's advertisers were doing that, we'd be in a good spot. But they're not. I mean, just to be blunt, we know that is not how most businesses function. So that is not how most advertisers function. So the more they propagate the advertising that's taking place, the worse off we are societally and environmentally. That's how I see the impact. So my sense is they are on net undermining that future that we want. And to that end, I'm going to do what I do with other stakeholders, which is I'm going to share my screen for just a moment, and I'm going to ask me to do some ranking. This feels a little surreal. I feel like I'm like stepping across the, no, that's not right. I feel like I'm stepping across the fourth wall here, but it's kind of interesting, and I appreciate you humoring this. So I'm just going to open up the assessment. Why am I not able to do that on my very own? Try that again. Please stand by. Let's see now. I think this will work. Yeah. Okay. I think it was working already, but I'm using two screens. So what I ask stakeholders to do is consider ranking. I personally think the 2x2 ranking game is a problem and is part of what has made traditional materiality analyses ineffective. But I'm taking a different spin here, which is instead of ranking issues, I'm asking companies to rank the whole company in relation to the future we want. And the vertical axis is understanding a company's impact, their business model and current impact on ecosystem health. Anything above the line is contributing to the future we want, I want. Anything below the line is undermining it. On a horizontal scale, it is about contributing to societal health. Anything to the right of the line is contributing to the future I want. Anything to the left is undermining it. So where would I put Google? Well, I was giving this quite a bit of thought walking along the St. Lawrence River this morning. And the truth is, on the social side, so on the horizontal, I would put them to the right of the line. I do think there are very serious issues with the data, lack of data transparency, and we can't really separate environment and society. Of course, that's why this 2x2 matrix is silly. But I really want to indicate that it's my view the things that have been able to happen because of the collaboration, because of the kind of commons that has been created. Although other stakeholders have disagreed, and if you look at the overall rankings, you'll see I'm in a minority putting them this far to the right of the line. But I feel like credit where it's due, and it's pretty phenomenal what they have created in terms of infrastructure, in terms of laying the groundwork for the ingredients of the future I want. I won't deny extreme concern about the algorithms, about the AI, and about the business model, but my sense is that's a switch to flick versus the actual infrastructure and groundwork. So that's why I give them a pretty good ranking on the social. But on ecosystem health, I'm going to put them almost at the bottom. Actually, I'm going to put them all the way to the bottom, because it's my feeling that up until now, their connection with the environment and their activity to enable others' connection to the environment has been devastating. And I'll I guess I'll explain a bit more about that here now, which is, let's say, for example, like you could say, we learn about the environment by flowing more knowledge. Okay, like for example, Ricardo Cardim, you can see his interview, and he spoke on behalf of the Atlantic Forest, and he's a very highly trained botanist and landscape architect, and he speaks highly of how Google has allowed knowledge to flow in a way that wasn't possible before, and he can find things that he would be looking for, and that's terrific, and I wouldn't disagree with that. But he is part of a very small set of highly educated, essentially scholars in an area that is relevant to the environment, whereas most people are just not looking for that level of information. And so what do they find out about the quote unquote environment? Well, they're looking to go on vacation. Maybe they want to go on an eco holiday. Maybe they want to go to a national park. So they're using Google to, book their Airbnb, find a place to stay. They're looking at the maps. How far away are these places? What's the terrain like? What's the weather like? Those are really important things. I don't think we should hide that information. But nowhere that I'm aware is the ecosystem and its history, its changes through development over time, its changed relationship with humans. Nowhere is that really prevalent. So taking something like a national park, it's all about, preserving the park with very little dialogue on, what's a park? And this is another place where people sometimes spit their coffee out at me, or maybe just spit at me. But, parks are kind of part of the problem. Like the idea that we have to tape off sections of our world and set it aside so we don't wreck it. The idea that we set those aside and say we go there to be in nature, and the rest of the time we're just doing our thing. First of all, just from a mindset perspective, that's horrific. To say, over there is nature and we'll try not to wreck it so that we can do the stupid things over here. And for, 50 weeks of the year, we'll be in barfy land so that 2 weeks of the year we can be somewhere nice. Already, I'm kind of not on board with that mindset. But then going into a more practical nature, what we've done in a lot of places by sort of sectioning off these parks is breaking what was actually a healthy relationship between humans and parks. And so, or where that land was, that's now called a park. And so the natural stewardship, the natural relationship and interaction between humans and forests and riverbanks and pathways and the migratory species and the grazing animals and has become very cordoned off, very controlled, very managed. And to me, that leads to these kind of tokenized stories of like what happens when wolves get reintroduced to Yellowstone Park and things that are, neat and informative and maybe inspiring in some way. But to be blunt, it to me just highlights how separated we got from things, and now we have to go to a park. And so if Google went beyond that with the environment, if Google actually lifted up information, if it incentivized advertising for things that offered services and products that genuinely informed and empowered us to be those people in relation to our ecosystems, our local terrain, I would give them a way higher mark. But for now, they're just kind of like repositories of maps so we can go trample on things, and then repositories of products and services so that we can buy the gear and find the place more efficiently and buy the gas and rent the car and, learn how cool it used to be and how many big trees used to be there. And that just doesn't cut it for me. On behalf of the St. Lawrence River, I say, Google, I want more. I want you to serve up deeper understanding of the relationships that would enable this river to be truly healthy, and how it got to be where it is now, which is, some of the islands are just made of construction fill. It still happens that raw sewage gets pumped into the system when, the storm system can't keep up on behalf of the city. How is it? Let's ask that question more bluntly. And Google, maybe you can tell us, how come sewage gets treated the way it does? How come we're flushing drinkable water down our toilets? How come every household just pushes their human waste into a system that some other entity has to deal with? And when things don't go well, they get permission. They literally get official regulated permission to pump it into the river. Why aren't we functioning like other ecosystems that manage their waste in the moment on site? That we know how to compost human waste. By the way, composting toilets are all over the place, and we know better than to flush potable water at a time in human history where water is about to be a bit like gold and oil. So, Google, where are you on that? And could you get somewhere sooner in terms of incentivizing advertisers who provide knowledge, services, products in that regard, and or information, so that the average vacationer or day tripper or hiker can experience greater awareness and shift their own everyday steps towards what would make this mighty river flow that much better. Anyways, that's why I put them where I put them. I'm going to stop sharing and move into other parts of the interview, and we're coming to the last questions. So I dreamt up these imaginative questions for stakeholders, and obviously I dreamt them up because I love dreaming about these things. So I'll just share some of my dreams here. First one is this just in: I am in charge of everything and nothing is in the way. Obviously, I really love that question. What changes would I make to the company? So, I mean, this one, especially because Google is just so expansive and covers so much, is hard to put in a nutshell. But I was thinking about this morning as I was walking along the banks of the St. Lawrence. And the first thing I was thinking, as I'm in charge of everything and nothing is in the way, is I would have Google cease all advertising except that which is promoting products, services, or the flow of knowledge that is in service of life. And of course, that's a tricky question, right? Who decides? How do we know? And so as the person in charge of everything, I would enable a network, a committee, a resource of humans who are minded to know the answer to that. And of course, it would be an evolving answer, and it would be a dynamic process, but these would be folks of and in a worldview that understands the imperative of the economy serving life and not the other way around. And they would be empowered to yay or nay any advertisement. Anything else simply does not show up. That customer is not welcome. Their money does not enter the coffers of Google. I realize that's a pretty big shift, but that would be one of the very first things that I would insist on. And I thought about it for a little bit, like, why not actually just remove advertising altogether? Why not say advertising ends? Because it's pretty easy to put that sector into the crosshairs. And I mentioned off the top, I've done a lot of work with different sectors. I've worked over the years with 3 global media companies. It's been pretty interesting to see the relationship between advertising and media. And I'll say that there's a lot of blur. I also did a lot of strategy work with a very large education company. And I would say there's a lot of blur between advertising, media, and education. And the blur basically boils down to, what do people find out, when, how, and more specifically, what don't they find out, and what's missing there and what matters. So the reason I wouldn't stop advertising altogether is because I think it can serve an amazing purpose if it enables and incentivizes us to make new and better decisions and to live in relation to one another and the rest of our world in a way that enables the conditions for life to thrive. Then yeah, let's have at it. And just like I believe that Google has created very worthy infrastructure that shouldn't all just go away, I believe the advertising sector has also created very worthy instruments and mechanisms and awareness and capacity to influence. And so we don't want to lose all of that. I just want to use it as a force for healing, a force for genuinely contributing in a way that is meaningful. And so that committee of knowers who are really knowing, they're not using a checklist. They're using a knowledge, a deep-seated wisdom that comes from generations of understanding that we are only as healthy as our ecosystems, and our ecosystems are our home. So they're able to do that. So that would be the number one thing I would do, is stop all harmful advertising and make room for the truly fantastic stuff that would build and shape and contribute to the future I want. And then the other thing I would do is I would basically require the executives of Google for all of their quarterly earnings calls going forward, when they're communicating with their investors and others who listen in on those calls, that they shape the narrative that they're sharing. So the data, the stories, the anecdotes, the updates around how, to what degree they are contributing to that future we want. And they start there, and all the other information cascades from that. Because right now, they're hyper focused on how the financial returns are going across basically the advertising channels and then some of the other bets. And anytime things that we might call sort of ESG related come up, they're very perfunctory, and in my mind really miss the mark. Like their carbon neutrality is, honestly, it's not even a joke. I think it's dangerous. I think it's indicative of how far off we are from really understanding what needs to happen with climate. Because Google can claim that they are carbon neutral, they can check all kinds of boxes in the mainstream ESG world, and yet that's really speaking to their operations and a few other sort of bits and bobs that connect to their direct, four walls, when, as mentioned a few minutes ago, their real impact is in the companies that they interact with, who advertise through them, who, let's not forget, contributed 80% of the 259 billion US last year. That is how they make their money. That is how they have their impact. And so saying that they're carbon neutral verges on absurd. I would want to hear, how are you empowering your advertisers, who of course are only those fantastic life enabling companies, to grow, to have more influence, to enable others? Because I know when we get this right in that future I want, we're not talking about a few more behemoths growing and becoming these ginormous creatures. We're talking about a distributed, enabling, networked sort of hub and spoke, and many hub and spoke, almost kaleidoscopic in its granular interactivity. We're talking about lots of these guys. So how is Google enabling each of these to enable each of those to enable each of those? That is where the real power for forward motion into that future we want will be. So that's what I would be asking the universe of Google to do. And I'm so glad that I'm in charge, because I'd really love to see that happen. Alas, the next question that I ask is, turns out I'm not really in charge of the whole world, and there are a few things in the way. So, but something else has just happened. This just in. I have a direct line with Google CEO, with Sundar Pichai. He takes my calls immediately, and he really appreciates what I have to say. The thing is, he's super busy, so I only get 30 seconds with him. What do I say to him? And this one's tricky because I'm a little bit prolix, as you've no doubt noticed here, and if you chatted with me anywhere else. But I think what I would say to him in 30 seconds is basically, I don't know what you were going to do this weekend, but I'd like you to change your plans and step outside on your own power, walk, run, cycle, skateboard, no motor, and get yourself to a place you perhaps already know, that is as unpaved and unbuilt as possible. And just spend some time there. Just go and be there, and arrange the time so that an hour or so after you've been there, you're joined by a guest, and that guest is from the worldview that I talked about that would be on that Who Can Advertise committee. And just spend some time with them, holding questions and listening to his or her ideas about that spot. Spend as many hours there this weekend as you can. Thanks for taking my call, Sundar. Those are all the questions I have for myself. I have, of course, lots more, but I won't spend time here. I thank you for coming with me on this journey and humoring the exercise. There's so much more I'd love to say. This river sits behind me and sits near me in real life, and I get to walk with it almost every day and run with it. And there's lots more I want to try to tease out in terms of understanding the perspective of non-human stakeholders and how we can be in their service. And I really welcome your questions and answers, frankly, and what you're hearing and seeing and sensing when you hold those questions or ideas in your own community, in your own river basin or mountain range or sand dunes, or when you're swimming in the rivers, lakes, oceans. Because I think that's where a lot of the answers lie, and we just need to spend a little bit more time asking the questions. Thanks again for coming along, and look forward to hearing your thoughts and seeing what comes up next. Bye for now.